story that I tell about Noel's grocery store, and I won't bore you with it, but I was shown some respect because of the clothes I wore. And I felt like I had a responsibility to live up to when I put on a uniform, and it gave me a sense of purpose. And I decided to go to school, so I went to college. Back then you had to have a college degree or 60 college credit hours. So I went to Warrensburg to school to be a police officer in Columbia. I worked in Sedalia for about 14 months because back then you could not get a job without the academy or with the not having experience. So eventually I came back in 1998. I came back to Columbia, came back home. I worked patrol for several years. A lot of my life revolved around the drug trade. My brother was involved in the drug trade. A lot of times that's how we got food at our house. But I also saw the other side of that and how it hurt people, and I wanted to be a drug detective. So 2005, I was able to become a drug detective, and I worked plainclothes narcotics for 5 years before being promoted. I was a sergeant over street crimes and narcotics, and then got promoted again, went out to, because after being in narcotics for 8 years, the best position to be in is training and recruiting, so they moved me out there. It was a little bit of a shock to me, but I did training and recruiting for 3 years, and then came back to patrol as a lieutenant, where I was a shift commander, both on midnights and day shift. I really felt like we got away from the relationships I had when it used to be called Beat 50, it's now Beat 20, but I worked the central part of the city when I was on patrol. There were a lot of good people there that had to put up with a whole awful lot, and not just from people that were back then open air selling drugs on Garth and Worley, prostitutes walking the street, but I felt like that part of the city was in disrepair, and police were heavily focused there, so that disproportionately affected other people. And a lot of, there were a lot of grandparents that I identified with because I was raised in part by my grandparents. And I really felt a connection to that area. Felt like we got away from those relationships. So Mike Hester and I formed the community outreach unit, partly because we had seen what prior administration had done, and they put 2 white police officers in a predominantly black park. And I didn't feel like that was appropriate. I didn't feel like it was had any long-term effectiveness. And the people that I knew from that neighborhood felt like it was an occupying force. So I asked if we could do this community outreach unit, actually go into the neighborhoods and meet people and not just hang out in the park for 8 to 10 hours a day. So we started doing that, and we started having some success. A lot of things happened, and I ended up being the interim chief. A whole lot of things I never expected to happen. There is a lot of there. There's a lot. A lot of things outside of my control, and I'm thankful for that. I feel blessed that I had that opportunity, and I feel blessed that I have this opportunity.
We are happy to have you, and I want to open up to other questions that people may have just about your life experience, and then we certainly want to talk about, your leadership now. Are there questions just about Chief Jones' past or anything, and kind of how he got where he is now? Because I know the more pressing issue is kind of where we're going forward.
If I can ask a question and maybe kind of blend it into a thought. So my question really is, why does someone become a police officer today in Columbia, Missouri? And it kind of folds into the thought about why you decided to become a police officer, and the bigger, I don't know if you want to call them the elephant or whatever you want to talk about it, is there's always there's a tension, So let me back. My brother's a policeman in St. Louis. He's a retired policeman in St. Louis. Not a great place to be a policeman from the standpoint of the danger, we worry about it. But my point is, it's always a weird thing in some ways when we want African Americans to become police, but there's animosity toward the police from the African American community because of some of the very things you mentioned, that the communication's not there. They're often the victims of police. And yet, we all recognize that when we call the police, we want police to come when we're victims of a crime as well. So my original question was, why does somebody become a police officer? And how do the attitudes about policing and public service and that, how do they blend? How are those communicated and expressed in the police community nowadays?
So I think probably 95% of the people when I do interviews and training, recruiting, hiring police officers, they would say, I want to help people. And I think if they're like me, when you got to the point where you decided you were going to be a police officer, helping people meant being empowered to make decisions that positively affected other people's lives, whatever that meant. You know, whether you arrest somebody who's hurting someone else, or exercise discretion and don't arrest someone to get them some other service. Those were things that, as a young police officer, I took a lot of pride in, and still do. But I think other police officers have that same desire. But some of what we need to gain is empowering, especially minority communities, to feel like they are empowered to have that type of influence. And you know, I don't claim to be anything but growing up in a poor house. But even with that, I never felt a sense of empowerment. That came to me by accident because my grandmother forced me to do something that was completely outside of the norm for me.
And that was the cadet program?
It was.
Yeah. Do you still have it, does it?
We started it back up here a few months ago.
Okay, I was gonna ask if you still have that. That would be a vehicle for outreach, just so
Right.
we know more about that.
But especially as teenagers and even young adults, you have to have some sense that if you're going to go down that path, that there is a chance for success going down that path. And I think we're getting to a point where there are more and more people and minorities who feel like that is the case. But with that animosity, a lot of that comes with feeling a sense of powerlessness, knowing that you have the ability, the capability, the desire to change things in your own community, but not really given the influence to do that. And I think the more, especially the youthful people that we try to recruit or bring into this this process, for lack of a better term, of understanding what they are capable of, what they're capable of changing, I think that's where the focus needs to be, is empowering young people to really make meaningful changes. Because where I grew up, everybody there was destined to the same fate. We were all going to be dishwashers. We were all going to be doing some menial labor, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but that was just our lot in life. And to say that I was going to be a police officer, let alone be a police chief 30 years later, that was not something that was even imaginable for me. So we have to get to the point where not just minorities, but people who want to serve and have that, are service-minded, feel empowered to do that. I hope that answers your question. But you have to find ways to do that by really making a sincere, authentic approach to these young people who really have the ability to change everything, but don't feel that sense of empowerment to do it.
There's so many entities that makes African Americans not want to be a part of association. For example, a lot of like internal affairs, fraternal order of police, police union, da. All of those, most of those organizations have such a negative connotation to them, simply because as we look at films, as I had some experience working with a small police force, there wasn't a single time that African Americans were considered to be doing the right thing. Every 99.9% of the time, regardless of what was on that tape or on that video, these organizations saw me, us, as doing the wrong thing, when it was so obvious that it was not. And again, it's a bad, the image, I think, has to be corrected. There has to be a lot done to the image of policing. But I do like the thing about getting young people involved at a young age, because there is a chance that they may change that. But the last thing I want to say is this image that we have now, using snitches and, again, community police and because we just don't see, let's take Columbia for example. This is one of the, I've lived in a lot of cities. I don't remember Columbia being this way when I left 40-something years ago and come back, because now, from what I understand, the police department only responds to gunfire, to rapes, robberies, and things like that. In most other places, the police is the first to get to any 911 call. So it is so difficult for me when I come back to Columbia. They never show up for anything other than acts of criminology, if I could say that. So again, I like the point of getting youth involved now, but I think that codes of silence and all those things have to be eradicated. Something has to happen there to get rid of those things, because I can be a police all day. I mean, not me personally, because I couldn't do your job, man. Ooh, it's just not.
You might be able to.
No, absolutely not. So I have all the love and respect for you, man. And anybody else that put on that uniform, much love and much respect for me, because I couldn't do it.
I do want to speak to something, and that's, well, two things really. One, when you talk about the imagery, the things that happen through the press, social media, fraternal order police, television shows, all of those things that none of us have complete control over. What I do see is that people get pigeonholed, and you know, if one black 19-year-old did something with a gun, then that translates to every 19-year-old black guy. I don't have that same, I don't feel that same pressure as a white guy. I recognize that.
Okay.
As a police officer, I do have some of that. You know, if one police officer hits somebody, shoots somebody, says something bad to somebody in Texas or Florida or California, then that translates to all police officers. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know how to fix that, other than the second thing you said, is that we do walk around in this community. Columbia is not so big that everybody has to walk around and not know each other. If you see me at Walmart, from here on out, you're gonna come up and say hi to me, I would suspect. But when at some point in the last 20 years of me doing this, we got away from that.
Anecdotally, it appears when there's conflict, and there's often conflict, that there's a different approach tactically when there's African Americans involved versus when there's another subject involved. And I know this is anecdotally, and it doesn't apply to any specifics, but you can see a white guy drunk, just wailing, killing, and somehow that guy lives. You know, a black guy can do, just for my example, the same thing, and he gets lit up. How do you, through your training in your academy, have a de-escalation policy, tactics that are administered the same, whether or not the subject is black, white, and different? How do we get to the point where the black subject, and I guess it's adding on to Al's point, doesn't get a harsher treatment approach from the police officer than the white subject doing exactly the same thing? How do you get to that implicit bias factor?
Well, we do implicit bias training, but I keep saying this, and I keep saying this over and over again, this is about relationships. And I will tell you that, and just keeping it real, what you just said, I can't think of an instance where someone was treated differently in a use of force because they were black, Hispanic, or otherwise, as opposed to a white guy. I cannot think of one. Now, I do see that in the media, to where you look at it and go, why did they do that? Now, I wasn't there, but you look at them, like everybody else in this room, and go, why would they have done that? But I have been present for, gosh, I don't know, hundreds, if not thousands of instances where we've used force over the last 20 years. And I have seen it applied consistently. I've seen cops do things wrong that were addressed. And I'm not talking about criminally wrong. I'm thinking, they get scared and they accidentally pull the taser. I can think of an instance where, and this was a white guy, but we're in a hotel or a hospital room and he starts fighting staff and they tase him. And you can use a taser in one way. You can put it on somebody and stun them, and then it's supposed to lock up their muscles. But then if you want to deliver a second burst that they start fighting again after it stops, you push a different button and it delivers another one. Well, if you pull it the wrong way, it shoots probes out of it. So I watched a cop drive stun somebody and then being worked up, pulled the trigger the wrong way, and the probes shoot out into the wall of the hospital at the university. You see those things happen too. But we have to be very careful to focus on what happens in Columbia and have the real conversations. Is that happening here? Is that something we see somewhere else? And if it is happening here, how do we address it? I don't think training is the only answer to all of that. I think you have to build relationships so that you can have conversations like that. Because a 22-year-old cop is not going to feel comfortable going to a man his father or his grandfather's age and saying, no, that's not right. Us as grown men, we might have that conversation, but these younger cops may not. And we have to have the relationships to where people feel comfortable.
What are you doing now structurally to improve, to change, to address not only community, concerns around here, but just how you plan to move forward? Yes, relationship building, that's a good foundational thing, but structurally, any reform efforts that you really look forward to putting in place now? Some really tangible structural things that you're doing.
Yeah, so just at a base level, one of the things that we did right away was I said, we're not doing saturation patrols anymore. With the exception of DWI, we'll go into areas where we know that there are alcohol sales and we'll saturate those because I think that's reasonable. But doing blanket saturations in an area of town, especially when they're predominantly black or Hispanic, disproportionately stops people that have no involvement in the activity we're trying to discover or mitigate. So we have started using intelligence to focus on people and places. And I don't know that that'll change disparity numbers right off, but what it does do is it stops us from adversely impacting people in neighborhoods that really don't have any reason to get stopped other than some minor traffic infraction. And if we're up there because we want to find a shooter and we're stopping cars because taillights are out, that is a mechanism we use to do that, but it should be more focused on the people who we're looking for and not, going up there and just blanket stopping everyone.
Initially, you talked about the shortages of the force. Just curious to see how short is the force, what numbers do you expect as far as reaching, and what are you doing as far as the recruiting efforts, particularly on the minority side? You talked briefly, sounds like we have a good person in that was just promoted, that's going to be
Right.
doing some great things, so just curious to see that.
So, right now, I think we're 11 or 12 down. We had some people retire recently, which we're always going to have. So the number that we're down is not huge, but when you're so far behind in the authorized strength of the police department, those numbers become more impactful, if that makes sense. We already don't have enough cops, so when we take the ones that we are authorized and we can't fill those spots because of people retire or move on to another job, or they don't cut it in field training or whatever that is, it really has a bigger impact when we don't have the numbers that we should have. I think the police cadet program will be strong in that. I'm also negotiating a contract with CPS that has officers more involved with students and their families in the schools. That's how it's intended. So that we're not just there as a security force in the school. If they want security officers, they can hire those. But I'm hoping that the relationships that they build in those schools will empower, I say kids, but they're really young adults in high school to reach out and go down that path.